Where do I even start? Artificial intelligence for open source. So like what you can expect me to talk a lot about is a combination of economics and artificial intelligence because that actually like something that started like a long time ago when I was on apprentices at like a pretty like arcane German research facility at this professor who's like a big shot in European cryptography, developing currently the virtual digital currency for Switzerland. And I got lucky, and he was my supervisor, and was writing my thesis after university, like 5 p.m. or something. Going to this place, saying, "Cool, I'm here for my like being a research associate. What am I supposed to do, right?" And like you can imagine this like tall, like German looking guy with like exploded haircut, um, wearing big glasses. He was like, look at this like vulnerability the backlog that I sent you. Okay, there's this spreadsheet, this big Excel sheet. I wanted to prioritize it. The meeting is tomorrow. We're meeting managing director of a German Mittelstand business. Okay. So I was sitting in this like empty computer hall. It was 5 p.m. and like this guy had Martin had the reputation of being extremely good at what he's doing, but also like reckless in terms of like how he dealt with the students. So he gave me this like Excel sheet, and it was a few thousand vulnerabilities in it, and I was asked to prioritize them for a pitch to the managing director the next day. Okay, I was supposed to pitch security vulnerabilities to someone who didn't know what cross-site scripting or anything of that is, right? Um, so I looked at a spreadsheet, and so I had some CVSS data, some severity data and whatnot. And this was the first time when I understood, okay, there is a problem in security, which is fundamentally an economic problem, because there is just no way that I could sort this spreadsheet in a way where it made sense to this managing director. Okay, I had like no framework, no um, sort of like guidelines, and actually to explain why the spreadsheet mattered to the managing director, because there was a like language missing, which I think is economics. So that's probably something that I can talk about for a long time. I had a very similar situation later at Ethereum, where they like asked me to review 9 different Ethereum implementations. Like Ethereum has a multi-client strategy. Saying, hey, like get this Tobias Held over here. I had been working for them for as a security engineer for some time, and they wanted to have a team that secures the merge. And it was a similar situation, because if you have a multi-client network, right, which Ethereum still is today, they have a JavaScript client, they have a like partially finished like Python client, they have a Rust client. Um, and they asked me and like 2 other guys to actually like do the final checks before the system merged to proof of stake, um, which is like a $200 billion transition. And it was supposed not to go wrong, right? And like Ethereum proof of stake was like building a spaceship. There's like there were hundreds of people like from all over the world, Taiwanese people, Polish people, like people from Berlin, meeting like every like 3 months or something to synchronize on how to develop like 9 different variants of this very same protocol that Ethereum is today. And then they said, like Tobias and these 2 other guys, they're supposed to find like do the final checks and find the final catastrophic vulnerabilities that could make the merge go wrong. And same situation, right? So way too much code, way too many vulnerabilities to actually even know where to get started. And yeah, I think the approach was the same. So we just got together and said, okay, like how can we actually prioritize um, Ethereum code bases in a way where what we do makes sense. And if you look at a validator today, so Ethereum validator stores, roughly speaking, maybe like 70,000 euro at today's courses. And we said, okay, we're not going to look at any problem that's not, inflicting more than like 5 million in damage was the number that we chose then. Okay. So we're going to ignore all the problems that have like a smaller blast radius than these 5 million. And that's a sort of a thing which is, I think, very relevant to what the OpenJS does and what most like open source stewards and foundations are doing, right? So because you have this like vast ecosystem perspective and you're supposed to like secure it somehow. And yeah, that I think is what we can talk about. So how can we find projects that are important for other people to help them secure those projects and help maintain or secure the projects? I think that's maybe what I would be interested in, like learning from this group. If we talk about AI specifically, AI is more a tool to achieve that purpose. But I think understanding which open source projects are critical to and like valuable, I guess, to certain enterprises, certain ecosystems, and how can we find them and how can we quantify that in a way and how can we understand it in a way so enterprises have a better time than, like this managing director where I actually like showed up and said, okay, like here's the spreadsheet. Like we don't really know what is important to your business. Like back in the like, research Fraunhofer institution where I started, that was the result, right? So I didn't have a way of prioritizing those vulnerabilities. So I basically handed over the whole like spreadsheet, and the managing director was like, okay, yeah, fine, like thank you. That's like not helping. Now I have a spreadsheet full of problems. Um, I will come back to you on that, right? And I think we're in a similar situation with open source security, where there's just like way too many things that could be important that could matter, and we don't have a good approach to actually prioritize that stuff. And I think that's how I see it. And I think that makes it difficult for anyone doing open source security, because if you think about it and you're maybe a small tech organization, right? So you have your 50 employees, and you actually want to invest in open source. And I think you might, have one engineering day that you want to invest. I think currently the entrance barrier to make that investment and to actually say, okay, I want to have one engineer work for one day on that one specific, package that my organization depends on, or these like 5 packages or something like that. I think the entrance barrier to do that is so high that most organizations end up not doing anything because it's just like way too complicated and way too expensive to figure out where you can sort of invest your smaller investment. So I think that's how I would describe the situation today. And how AI plays into that and it can actually make a difference, I think is sort of like a secondary step. So did you have a conversation earlier maybe that you can attach to where, okay, we solve all these like technical problems and we have all these kind of like guidelines and we go through them and we have the CRA, when we look at those in isolation and it's kind of like we're patching holes where we don't understand, okay, what is the upstream finance of that specific hole that we're patching? And like, what do you think? Is it clear to you what's the return on investment for other organizations, enterprises that are depending on this work to happen? Is there a way of how we can explain that to an organization right now?
So let me restate the question back to make sure I understand it. Is there a way of taking a bulk, like a big batch of security vulnerability data across dozens, hundreds, thousands of vulnerability findings and being able to reasonably prioritize them in a thoughtful way?
Yes, I think that's a good way of describing it because it's very broad. You can think about, okay, you're Goldman Sachs and you want to understand like what is my exposure to open source risks, and how can I fix
Mm.
it? Okay, so as Goldman Sachs, I want to like quantify my open source security risk. I want to quantify my exposure, and I want to proactively mitigate it before it bites me.
I mean, I feel like that would be something that would be impossible for us to do from the outside. Like we can't quantify, we don't know what Goldman Sachs is doing, right? I mean, we might know that they've got like they may publicly tell us, oh, we're using these 4 or 5 packages, but like in terms of quantifying for them what the impact might be on their business, like we wouldn't have any of the information available in order to come up with anything, right? But they could.
Yeah, I think
Right?
you can communicate like the severity of an issue in isolation of its implementation to some degree, but um, the challenge is, of course, that you don't know how the thing is being used. And this is it's a really interesting code analysis problem, is that, okay, what part of this library do we actually care about and use versus the 90%, 95% of the library that we don't care about and we don't use? Um, Finding whenever I've done a couple exercises in my career where we've gone through all of our open source software as an enterprise to figure out what's there and what's going on, what needs to be paid attention to. And frankly, the number one thing is just reliably updating libraries when there's new versions. Security has all these really sexy things about it, but frankly, the things that get most organizations in trouble are like the basic stuff. Like, I've never seen a commercial enterprise, regardless of how many billions of dollars it's worth, consistently update all of its open source dependencies when they should, because it's just such an extraordinary lift. Like, JavaScript can be a little bit better because of NPM and all of that, but um, yeah, it's really quite challenging for an organization to do that. Um, yeah, Steve, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you just typed.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think you're pretty spot on. Just dealing with your normal dependency updates and not using end of life software is a challenge at enterprise scale. It
Hmm.
requires a lot of extra reporting, extra diligence at a scale that's hard to do. Usually, you bring in vendor products to help with it. So
Hmm.
things like I don't even know. I mean, you can look at a bunch of things. Red Hat has an open source thing that they're pushing that kind of brings SBOMs, Guac, and all the tooling around OpenSSF together to help with that to analyze risk of your dependencies based on your SBOMs. But to hook that into your current systems is hard and time consuming too. So unless you've architected from the beginning your um, build system and software artifact systems to deal and report that data, you're always playing catch up. I think at least in my view.
I mean, as a sort of, okay,
Yeah, go.
my rules of engagement say, please interrupt me when I talk about stuff that's
Yeah,
not
no,
relevant.
please do.
I'm part
Yeah.
of the church of interruptions. So just go ahead and just say, like, please be short with me. Okay, so one of the nicer things of the Cyber Resilience Act is that we actually can expect SBOMs for like pretty much everything that's important in the European Union. So I think that we're like with the Cyber Resilience Act moving into a paradigm of like stuff is going to be a lot more transparent than it is today. So it's not going to be, um, we have no idea what this organization is actually using for most apps and most products that are like being shipped and sold. They already have, for like legal and compliance reasons, have an inventory of all the components that they're using and all the open source components that they're using. And so I think that there is a lot of information about how organizations are building their infrastructure. Some of them, like Netflix and whatnot, are actively reaching out, building open source program offices, trying to engage with the open source ecosystem, right? So when we talk about, yeah, this is all like very difficult and end of life is not even like done properly, and like patching in a large enterprise is impossible, aren't we kind of just singing the same old song that we're just like used to singing, which is
Yeah.
security
Mhm.
is hard and we can't have
Until you get
security
hit.
because
Yeah.
That's
Until you
exactly right.
actually experience an issue, you're not like the cost benefit isn't there until it's too late. Unfortunately. And that's wrong. I mean, we
Well,
have to
this is
bring
the
this
same
to the
dilemma that
forefront.
public health has, right?
Yeah.
Like,
That's right.
it's that when it's working, you don't notice anything, and
Right.
it seems like an extra cost. And as soon as it's not working, everything's falling apart.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, I
I
think
mean,
the challenge here, to Steve's point, and I think is that um, really the thing an organization has to do is go back and rebuild their CI/CD pipelines effectively to be able to really do what we're talking about in the context of open source. And a lot of organizations, I've been doing security consulting for a long time, and it is shocking how many real household name companies have such brittle release pipelines. Like I can tell you, like there are big name companies that rely on that one computer right there is the only one that can build this software. We cannot
yeah,
get it
that's
to rebuild
bad.
other places.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just being real. Like that's how bad some of these things are, and that's sometimes years of engineering for an organization to get over. And
Yeah, there was one thing, Tobias, that you said about it's it's better for when companies are able to publish their SBOMs publicly
mm,
or when they're releasing software. But a company like mine and Goldman Sachs, we're both banks. So the last thing we want to do is tell you the exact dependencies and versions we're using because
mhm.
that could introduce a vector for attack. And yes, I mean, obviously we have systems that are reporting the vulnerabilities and we do update them on a schedule and all that kind of stuff based on their severity. But some companies are going to take a zero vulnerability stance that doesn't matter if it touches your code touches it. And then there's some companies that will do the the path based. If your code actually touches it, then it has to be remediated. So there's two different even methodologies once you get internally on some of that stuff.
Well, the
now we're
path-based
now
stuff
we're now we're
relates.
getting go for it.
Oh, it relates to what Adam was saying earlier about like even among fully open source trees, nobody has figured out that I'm aware of a programmatic way of determining that a CVE doesn't apply
Right.
to a transitive CVE doesn't apply.
Mhm.
And so that is why
Too
that
hard.
creates 99% of the noise CVE notifications, or 99% of the notifications in NPM are noise. And this is why, like they're false positives because they're transitive dependencies or transitive vulnerabilities that don't actually apply to that use case.
Wait,
So if we
so
can't even figure out that when all of the code and use cases are 100% public, I don't
I
think
need
that
to interject here. I need
SBOMs
to
are going to
interject
help
here.
that.
I
Please.
need to so reachability is like not good enough for you, or you're like saying reachability doesn't really exist?
Saying reachability from a programmatic standpoint doesn't seem to really exist.
Okay, so I mean
Accurate
there is
reachability, I would
Yeah,
say.
accurate
Not in a
reachability.
way,
Yeah,
not
Accurate.
in a way
Yeah.
that is on can be automated at scale and expected to be accurate.
and
If you go
reliable. Yeah,
send, yeah, if you're okay with sending like a senior security engineer at the problem and giving them like some amount of time, then yes, you can get a decent assessment there. But I wouldn't trust a man. I wouldn't, having run a piecer for a major household name, I would not trust an automatic tool to tell me that, and I would not to make a decision based on an automatic tool for reachability. I just wouldn't.
okay. Okay, so I'm just gonna like find the OWASP thing. Which tools have you been trying to actually get good reachability? Or when you say like big
Um,
vendor, Adam, like what was that?
there's
What?
so I'm trying to remember the commercial tools we used, but they were all paid for commercial tools. They weren't open source tool. And yeah, I don't remember the names of them at the moment. I think if you gave me like I can get back to you on it and kind of look around. It's been a while since I've looked at these, but yeah, they're
Yeah.
just not reliable enough.
I also want to be cautious here with sort of the code of conduct. There is it's called dependency track, I think, from OS, which is open source, so I think I can talk about it. It's like, I think reachability in software composition analysis is becoming a commodity. So anyone can soon say this vulnerability, the CVE, with a 85% likelihood doesn't apply. Like, runtime reachability is a little bit more tricky than static reachability, sure. But like, if you want to just see that how kind of like the free open source stuff looks, you can check out dependency track. Like, I know the guy that's building the reachability module, so if you have feedback for him, I think he would actually be happy about that. And like, kind of like sidetracked to like the whole security economics AI kind of macro perspective on an ecosystem level, but I think reachability is getting better, both for static reachability and also runtime. If you're unhappy with this specific tool, I would be happy to kind of forward that feedback.
Yeah, I
So
think in the end, yeah, my experience has been like the tooling is not precise and helpful enough from having used a tool like that
Well, and
in a
I would add some color here, which is that in the
okay.
security industry, the typical philosophy is that false positives are better than false negatives, meaning security folks generally would rather see too many reports than too few.
Mhm.
better
But
safe
in
than sorry.
fact,
Yeah.
that completely undermines broad trust in the system.
Yeah.
And in fact, I would argue that a false positive is 1,000 times worse than a false negative, because you can always double check something and catch a false negative. But false positives mean people, like, that's why people just click agree on all the terms of service, because it's just too much noise. And if you get like 1,000 reports and only 500 of them are valid, you're just not going to read them. And so people are going to turn it off, or they're just going to
Okay.
be like, I'm not even going to use the software that has any vulnerabilities because I don't have time to triage it, right? And so, like, I think when it comes to like reachability, there needs to be a tool that's reliable in the sense that it never produces a false positive. It's okay if it misses stuff. It's not okay if it wrongly incriminates stuff. And that is the philosophy that I think has been missing from this tooling, which is why this has become such a big problem.
Interesting. I think the sort of false positive signal to noise ratio debate is an awesome one. I find your perspective in terms of saying we should stop optimizing for better safe than sorry as security engineers and go for better UX for anyone who's using the tool. It's quite new. I never heard it in like that very pure form of like, it's fine to have false negatives. Like, better have more false negatives than this
Right.
huge
Well, and no,
stockpile of false
I
positives.
don't think anybody believes that zero vulnerabilities means the software is secure. Like anybody with even the slightest bit of common sense or experience. And so therefore the risk of a false negative is zero, because there's always unreported vulnerabilities. So that's not actually a bad outcome. That's an expected outcome regardless.
Jordan, I think like that's such a hot take that we should probably have like one conversation just about this one. Like, it's interesting that, like the risk of a false negative is zero because there will anyway be residual vulnerabilities. It makes sense. I understand what you're saying, but I think it's quite a hot take, and yeah. we should probably have a conversation just about that.
It
By
is a
false
good
negative here,
philosophical
I
point.
mean the
I
like,
think
I
yeah,
actually
go ahead.
I agree. This is worth further discussion. It's I think Jordan has some very fair and valid points to this. One of the things that I think also comes down to on this is to like what Steve said, like we don't know what we can't tell Goldman Sachs what their risk is. They have to they know their threat model.
Yep.
They know what they
yeah,
care about.
that's like perfect, right? What I would like to invite you to do is actually flip that perspective here for a second, right? When it's not about, okay, like we have suddenly this technically pretty difficult objective to tell Goldman Sachs what is important to their organization, the open source ecosystem.
Mm.
When we look at it from the perspective that large organizations are setting up OSPOs, right? So they want to engage with the open source ecosystem, and they actually want to understand, okay, like how can we work with these specific projects, right? So if we flip it and just say, okay, we can probably not, like from our situation, tell them what specific component is going to be the next XZUtils or next Log4j. But what we can do is help build tooling and infrastructure and platforms and frameworks for the other direction. So if Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and a bunch of like other organizations say, well, actually it makes sense that we, like figure out what the next Log4j is before it becomes the next Log4j, and then invest like an order of magnitude or many order of magnitudes less in supporting the maintainer to mitigate those vulnerabilities. Maybe not at Log4j, but like at other instances where it's just XZUtils, I think, was a great example there, where if Leslie Collin had 3 enterprise security engineers helping him to maintain XZUtils, probably you wouldn't have that backdoor, right? So if we go down, not if we go down, but if we flip that narrative and say, okay, like how can we actually make it easier for large organizations to do the right thing for maintainers, then I think the picture is very different. Because, hi Chris, good to see you. I think if you're Goldman Sachs, you very well understand how your software is being made, right? So you don't have to reinvent your own build process if you want to understand, okay, what are the components that are in all my SBOMs. I think that's something that probably is the improvement in the security industry over the last couple of years, that okay, we have this ability that we know what we are using, we know what we have, right? And now the question is, okay, what's next? Because the main thing that I hear about SBOMs is that they're like, you cannot operationalize them. So now you have an SBOM, okay, great, cool. I have an SBOM, I can understand, like I have 1 million open source dependencies. What are you gonna do next? And sort of, if the foundations or whoever, right, actually takes on not the responsibility to tell organizations in which open source project security to invest precisely, but just help build that tooling and the framework to say, hey, I think here is a candidate of something that might become an XZ or it might become a Log4j. Let's get in there, let's analyze it more deeply and actually like get some health metrics on that project. And if we figure out, okay, is this an important project that is like under maintained, where something can be done, then let's send security engineering or engineering resources specifically to that project, and not just say, okay, like everyone should do more for open source, right? I mean, if we keep it in this framework where, okay, everyone should help maintainers and everyone should do more to actually help the open source ecosystem, I think that's just not operationalizable. That means no one will do anything because no one really knows what to do. So I think, yeah, like Steve, what you've been describing there, I think is also like quite relevant in terms of, okay, there's so much going on in terms of like tech and how to do that and how to like change build processes. But what role do you guys think like a steward can have, someone like the OpenJS Foundation in that model of, okay, you have large enterprises who try to build a good and healthy relationship with the open source ecosystem. So how can that process maybe be improved if we look at the existing process? What's realistic to like help an OSPO and help security teams that are working with the OSPO to actually help the maintainer? What do you think the OpenJS could do there, for example? Do you have some ideas?
I mean, I think the reason I come to these is to represent my company and bring a perspective of our company, essentially, or the financial industry in general. Obviously, I'm not representing Goldman Sachs or anything like that, but I can at least talk to the risk-based approach that we probably likely all share. The other thing is, obviously, Capital One, as a member of the OpenJS Foundation, is putting money towards the membership. We're members of a lot of foundations. like OpenSSF and Finos and all the things around our industry and the security and some of the languages we use like TypeScript, JavaScript, that kind of stuff. I think going through some of the stuff we've gone through in the past 6 months or so with Adams driving the checklist of things and seeing the effort the foundation puts into the projects that are part of its umbrella gives us, I wouldn't say a full sense of comfort, but knowing that if something came up, I'll pick on a project just out of random. If something comes up with Lodash and it's a log4j issue, which would never happen with that project, I would hope. But we know that the foundation will stand behind it and help them fix that in some fashion. They're not going to let the maintainer just go die on the vine. Whereas if we're using random XYZ package out of NPM by, a developer in Nebraska. Yes, I'm referring to the SKCD
Yeah.
thing. How do you get that developer engaged? And that's when we start to look at companies like Hero Devs that Jordan's part of, and other companies like Tidelift and others to
Yeah.
help make a relationship with those with our remuneration essentially, so that we don't have to do it on behalf of Capital One. We can go in and pay Tidelift or Hero Devs or whomever to go have that relationship with the maintainer and potentially help them solve it. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of the perspective that we take. We can't easily just go give money to an individual. It's just not how it works at a corporation. So, because they have to be a part of our relationship, they have to be vetted, all kinds of things. So we
Sure.
rely on the foundations to provide, I guess, that layer of abstraction, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think it's like a super important kind of perspective to many of the things that we're talking about here, right? So, I wonder a couple of things. So, does Capital One have an OSPO? Like, do you have actually like
Yeah.
a security? Okay.
We do.
So,
I'm actually our distinguished engineer in our OSPO. So I help figure out the technical side of how we're doing our governance, I engage with this foundation specifically. I have other distinguished engineers who engage with some of our other foundations and things like that.
all right, because I think, like paying a maintainer directly is a little bit of a probably like a difficult um a difficult thing in terms of like
Look how long it took corporations to pay bug bounties. And there's like,
right.
and I would think of it that way, right? Like to normalize that stuff. One of the things I would say, just I don't mean to bias, but there's an important thought
Go for
here
it.
that Steve mentioned is that the security compliance guidelines and checklists that we're supposed to be doing across all the projects in OpenJS. The purpose of that exercise is to identify, one of the purposes of it is to identify opportunities um, for special investment into a project. So this is basically one of the things you can think of it is like when we go talk to all of these projects, we should use that opportunity to identify some like big projects that if you threw cash at them and say, hey, give this project a security engineer for 3 months and magic could happen, just like Alpha Omega is doing with Node.js, for example, but maybe on a smaller scale. I think that is the way to go because the foundation, because of its relationships, is able to go hustle for that money and create all of the bureaucratic structure necessary to identify and take those opportunities and do something with them.
Just
Oh,
have to
Jordan, go
like
ahead.
interject here, Jordan, before you go for it. Like
Yeah, go ahead.
that's what I like love so much about this idea and this field and building that field of security economics, because like Steve, Adam, we started with security economics, econometrics, algorithmic, blah blah blah. And what you just like said is literally the core of the economic thing that needs to be built, right? Having a clear way for Steve and Capital One to quantify, okay, like what is our exposure to open source risk? And then here's a platform where you can actually like incentivize, pay maintainers in a structured, compliant way to minimize that exposure. And that's like so nice because you came up with it in, I don't know, like half an hour. Sorry, got really excited here, Jordan.
That's okay. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add that it's not about necessarily having magic happening. This isn't, and this is, I think, part of why it's open source in general has had, let me rephrase it. This is why corporations in general have had so much difficulty figuring out how to contribute to open source, because it's not a quid pro quo transaction like most corporate transactions are. It is a general purpose. We want a relationship with you. We want you to be a going concern. We want you to be we want to communicate with you, and we want to check in on your security practices and help you if you need it, and all those things. But many of them might not. The reason I love Tidelift is because I was doing all that stuff for free already. Like, it's been almost zero extra effort for me to get money for my open source packages. Like, not completely zero, but pretty close. And like, but now I have a contract around it. Like, now there's a something that corporations could rely on. Whereas prior, you can't, like, fiscally speaking, rely on, well, Jordan's a good guy who does a good job, right? You got to like have something. And so but it's a harder, for whatever reason, like the pitch for my custom like build in OSPO role a couple years back was essentially like, you don't wait to hire a lawyer until you get sued or you need to sue someone. You keep a lawyer on retainer, or you hire one in-house, so that you have relationship, rapport, credibility, expertise, and that they're there when you need them. And yet that concept of like, we want to have standards body relationships and open source maintainer relationships like ready when we need them, versus let's just go knock on doors when we need something, like that, for whatever reason, it hasn't translated over. And I think that's like, it's less about like, if you put in money, something concrete will happen. It's more that if you put in money, you're positioned to ensure that something bad concrete doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think it's so I think this idea that the foundation is a structure that can bring visibility to opportunity for funding opportunities is a great model. And I think the foundation is doing a good job of that. But there's a totally different scale that could be happening on once all the infrastructure is in place. One of the things, with just a couple minutes left, I'm going to like switch gears a little bit here for a second to talk about, just to kind of point out to you all, like, what does it really look like for an organization to do effective risk management on the inside once they've really focused on it. The measurement. So this is Zoom. I worked on like an earlier version of this internally, and they put this out after I left. And I want to share with you just like how different these things can be, because you'll notice it doesn't really take CVSS into account. This is how they calculate severity at Zoom. So, and it's very specific, and it's very much informed by an extraordinarily detailed threat model that took years to build out. So let's say it's in the desktop application, and then it gets into all of these specific details about the platform itself. Let's say,
sorry,
yeah.
I raised my hand, Adam.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. My bad.
No worries about that, but I feel we need to listen more closely and take more of a note of what Jordan has been describing. For a variety of reasons. We also have Chris here, and like I love the standard. I've seen the like Zoom doing like pretty like awesome work there a while ago. The camera is acting up. Okay. I think a few important things happened in this meeting, right? So we had like Steve giving a lot of detail in terms of, okay, here's like 1 million build security tools that people are working on, and they're kind of like hard to integrate, and you would have to start like pretty much everything from scratch. And we had this idea of, okay, there's a need for a bounty platform, some kind of platform that actually helps organizations to figure out what is their exposure to open source risk. And then Jordan actually went ahead and said, okay, outside of this whole good open source maintainer, underfunded, burned out, here's the enterprise just like consuming open source, never giving back, like this is standard, this is a song we're all singing. Same for like security songs that we're singing, like you cannot patch properly. But outside of that song, Jordan, I think how I understood you were describing how you like being in a structure where you have a contract and can actually like as a professional maintainer maintain your packages. And I think that's super important because we talk a lot about, okay, here's the checklist for the Cyber Resilience Act, here's the check for NIS2, here's the checklist for FedRAMP. Here is like 500 different checklists, okay, and those are all supposed to be like get done by the maintainers, which I think they're not, like typically. And I think what I heard here is, okay, there is a way where maintainers actually want to have that, structure in place where they can say, okay, here are my duties, my responsibilities, and here's my compensation, and this is how I can actually like professionally take care of my open source package, which I happen to be really great at. And I think having that perspective present, I think is important for like making that voice kind of like heard. So we step out of that moment of good maintainer, overworked, burned out, bad enterprise, just exploiting, and get into a mode where, okay, fascinating, like the enterprises are actually running OSPOs and trying to build relationships with the open source ecosystem, and maintainers are not just sitting there and rioting and throwing rocks, but actually say, hey, if I get a structure to do my job well, then I would love to have that structure. I think that's really important. Adam, how do we operationalize that? How do we get to how do we get to a point where we say, okay, like we don't fall asleep again and break out of the matrix? I don't want to put you on the spot, but you're great at organizing stuff. That's why I'm asking you. So
Yeah, I'm not sure. To be honest, I think what I think this is a situation where, well, here's a couple things. One, there are tech companies and highly regulated entities who are doing these things, standing up OSPOs and the like. But we shouldn't assume that that's the majority by any means. Like, it's very easy for us to kind of fixate on the tech 1% on these sorts of things, which in regards to topics like this is going to be highly regulated entities like finance and the really, really high-end tech companies that have the money to burn to be able to dedicate cash to these functions and care about what their pipelines look like and all that kind of good stuff. But once you get out of that like 95th percentile and up, the internal organization, we should assume, does not exist. And so I think what the foundation's already doing, but we just need to put more data into it and get the machine moving and get the flywheel moving, is identifying these opportunities at a project level that enable the foundation's leadership to go out and pitch ideas and to create a supply of opportunities that can generate the creation of OSPOs more broadly. Steve, tell me
Awesome.
how I'm an idiot, please.
No,
Awesome.
I think it's a good idea, but I think you also have to account for the maturation of specific OSPOs. Some are just there for appearances. Some, like mine, I think are there for more the governance and risk aspects and measuring what we're using, how we're using it, and scoring it. Kind of like what you showed with Zoom. Ours isn't public, but that kind of thing. And so we're probably more advanced than some others, but we're definitely not all the way. And
Mhm.
so there's a scale of your OSPO that, like you said, there's some that are zero. They don't even really have an OSPO. And then you probably have some that are very well organized and in tune with what their organization does. So I think that it's
Yeah.
actually a sliding scale. And, you know, perhaps there's a way you can help companies move up that ladder essentially. That seems like a broader thing than the OpenJS Foundation specifically, but I think it's an important thing to consider in any case.
I have some perspective on this from a contract I was doing last year with a household name tech company who, and I mean really household name, who was struggling, who was struggling with who should own an OSPO. Like there's a huge bureaucratic question on where should this thing land, and when
I have an
leadership
answer to that.
asks, yeah. Well, I mean, it all depends on the individual org chart of the
No, the
organization,
answer is
right?
you need a C-level person to be leading the hospital.
Oh, well, I mean,
Because
we
that is
can
how
all dream.
important and cross-cutting it is.
We
And
can
there's a guy that
we
gave a
can all
speech about
dream.
that from Wipro. Yeah, no, it's a
Um,
dream, but nonetheless.
um,
Anyway, sorry, go on.
One is that it's unless there's executive buy-in for it, it's effectively an unfunded mandate. Like
Mhm.
realistically, you need to dedicate at least one headcount to this thing. If you really want to do a good job, you probably need to dedicate more than one headcount. But let's just say they at least have one person dedicated to open source. Like that's a pretty solid security team if they have that. Like that's really high end. Um, and so the situation never got resolved while I was there because it all came down to like, well, who's going to give up existing headcount that they're doing for their current jobs to go do this open source stuff? And the answer was nobody, because there wasn't the executive imperative to force them to do it, and there was no support for headcount. So it just kind of languished. So I think um,
That gets to
with that,
that almost gets to Jordan's point of having an OSPO on retainer in some
Yeah.
respects.
it's a valid idea as a business model, and I've considered that kind of stuff too. It's interesting. The I think just like bug bounty, really, right? Some organizations are going to have a huge team internally. Some are going to have a point of contact where it's maybe their 50% job. Um, so I think the idea is that if we can bring these opportunities to companies and show them and show them the opportunity to get started, even in a way that doesn't require them to have headcount, but instead makes it very straightforward for them to say, hey, you have this thing. We should support this in a structured way. I think that is the way to create the supply that drives demand.
Thank you. I'm glad that you say that. I'm really glad that you say that because I just took on my product hat, right? My product hat is what you just said. I think the most important thing, two things, right? The most important thing is if you have banks, typically organizations who are really great with money, having the idea to say, okay, we're gonna pay someone with some degree of executive buy-in because you don't get an OSPO by asking, I don't know, in the kitchen, if you can start an OSPO, you have to have some buy-in, right? And they're starting that by themselves as a bank. That means there is some insight in the finance industry that open source is important, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. That means everyone else is missing the insight. And the second thing is putting on the product hat, open source program offices are incredibly difficult. Like I want us as a group to not say, yeah, well, someone else's problem. Like this is a group of the open source of the OpenJS Foundation, right? So what is our interface for an OSPO? Like what do we offer as a product to organizations who want to actually, who want to invest in open source? What is our what is our plug and play solution to that? Okay, you can join some calls and then you meet me and I'm gonna like rant for an hour or something like that, right? And that can be fun. But is it like something where you can like go back to your like C-level decision maker and say, here's what I did, here's my result, here's my KPI, here's my OKR, and now give me a raise, right? So that's what someone in an enterprise needs. And I think we just like utterly fail. I don't want to say suck, but I think we suck at making an interface for open source program offices to make sense for the enterprise. And I think that's what we should, that's what we should take away, and not, you know, sort of. But yeah, I think that's pretty much what you said, Adam. And I'm glad that you said it. So I'm not alone with my rant here.
No, I mean it totally, I agree. It totally makes sense. Um, and so I hope this year, as we do more checklists, and we do more surveys, we identify specific project opportunities that the foundation can go out and pitch to its network to get funding. And I hope we can really do a good job on that this year. I think to also be aware of with companies, and this is obvious, but I think it's important to say, is that they don't budget on demand. They budget a year in advance. And so another aspect of this is being able to create a backlog that is not not like immediately emergency urgent, but at the same time is something that they can that they can hear about in May, but then program the funding in for like January or February of the following year or something like that.
What is the opposite of an OSPO? Like what is the counterpart of an OSPO called? You know, when you have the plug, a cable, there's a socket, and you know, like what's the counterpart?
What do you mean?
Yeah, I don't know how that metaphor can apply here.
My English is missing here. So when you plug in a cable, you have a socket.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
And what's the thing at the cable called? At the end of the
Plug?
cable that you plug the plug?
Well, no, I get what you're asking. I don't personally understand how there can be a counterpart. Like not like departments in a company don't necessarily have a counterpart. Like
Yeah,
what's the
if
opposite of the legal department?
think about procurement. So
Are you asking like who they report to? Like who the
no. So if we are the plug, the OSPO is the socket, right? That's what I'm trying. If you think about procurement, it's actually quite funny. I know a guy who's selling to Walmart, and like he's a seller. This is his job, and Walmart has like the most intense like setup for making it really hard to sell to them, really standardized. You go into a small room in a very large building, and you have a specific, you know, amount of time to actually talk to that procurement officer there, right? So there is a counterpart thing in many organizations, in many parts of large organizations, right? When you have procurement, they have the sales teams on the other side, right? So this is how they, you know, plug and play. So what is our if the OSPO is our socket, how can we actually be a better plug?
that is folks like Robin and Ben. They're the ones going out there hustling, building those relationships, getting organizations like Capital One, for example, to become members of the foundation and be more involved. I think, yeah, I would say Robin in particular is that interface point. We just need to fill a backlog for her.
Okay, I'm trying to think if it really is a human, or if it's like some kind of like structure, or like a process or a mechanism or something like more than just like human go work that's typically like not super successful. So I think
I mean,
I think there's
I'll challenge that because you're talking about a model that corporations are familiar with is that someone is selling an idea from an organization, and there's a salesperson who's responsible for getting that thing over the finish line. So even though it's more of a grant than a purchase, the fundamentals of closing a deal and getting contracts signed and all that are still quite similar, I think, in practice. So I think it is very human, just like the sales cycle itself, not a standard enterprise software sales cycle, which is very heavy. It's a very heavy process with corporations.
But what can Robin actually sell?
She's selling opportunities to fund projects. Like the idea in this model, I'm not
Connections,
saying,
relationships,
yeah.
reputation,
So using that stuff to pitch
influence.
project ideas to people who have money to fund work on open source projects. So yeah, this idea, I think it is very much like sales, and I think you made a great point on that, is that the receiving end in a corporation for this kind of stuff is going to be an OSPO, if it exists. It could be the legal team because they are really hung up on licenses and care about that kind of stuff and need to disambiguate and figure out what's going on with their open source. And licenses are a great place, often the place where companies first start paying attention to open source, because they do have legal requirements for publishing like license information and all that stuff. And that's where I've seen a lot of corporations start with that. Or there's some catastrophic thing like Log4j or something smaller that affects them directly, that's deep in their code base, that suddenly turns into a huge fire drill and gets some focus on the problem from an executive perspective.
Okay, is it
Which,
cool? Is it cool with everyone if I just keep ranting and rumbling in the next meeting about how we should make this like a lot better as a product? So just taking what Jordan has said as some input in terms of, hey, this would be super nice to have just a structured and like well organized way of interacting with large enterprises, and at the same time just saying, okay, hey, large banks are building these OSPOs, so how can we make it just a better experience and a better product for them to do that? Make it easier and make it actually like an effective thing that enterprises can do is build an OSPO and work with the OpenJS. I have
I'd be
ton of
curious
ideas
about
on how to
Robin's
do that.
perspective because I haven't done this job. I'm just presuming based upon my experience from a product security team perspective. But I would be really curious to hear what Robin says and what actually would help, what and getting her perspective on what she thinks would actually help make this easier. Because I'm throwing out a lot of hypotheticals based on assumptions, but she'll have like the real deal information. But regardless of structure, regardless of that, I assume, just like software sales, that it's a very human intensive process to get funding get legal paperwork over the finish line, because that's just the way that it's not because it's open source or whatever. It's just because that's what's involved in getting corporations to spend money anyway, and that's what they're used to.
I think I can tell you what Robin is going to say, because I'm not 100% sure if the OpenJS is an antitrust foundation, but I think it most likely is. And if it's an antitrust foundation, it's not allowed to make any money. So it's all donations. It's all, like non-commercial activity.
It's nonprofit, if that's what you mean.
Yes.
Yeah, but antitrust, I think, is like quite strict. It's not only non-profit, it is also in a way, kind of anti-commercial in a way where, it's a safe ground for enterprises to meet and talk and whatnot. So I think there's a big part of what Robin can actually do is limited by that. But I think it doesn't stop us to think about that question in a way where we figure it out, at least on paper, as a process. Whoever actually executes that process then kind of like secondary, right? Where we say, okay, hey, let me I don't want to press on the AI button, but you can not only buy access to a human and influence by a human, but you can also use an artificial intelligence as that socket, as that interface for the OSPO to talk to an ecosystem, to actually engage with an ecosystem, to understand what is going on in that ecosystem, right? So there is so much more that we can improve than just saying, okay, like go big enterprise, go fix the open source ecosystem for us because you're using it. I think when we get out of that framework of bad big enterprise and like poor underfunded open source maintain, we can actually like get to a very productive conversation, which I had, which I want to thank you for. I do need to run because I'm letting someone else already wait for 10 minutes, which is not
Oh,
nice.
sure. No worries.
But this was no, I mean like this was like gorgeous. I like the conversation quite a lot. I do hope that we can keep like rambling about that topic in the next meeting.
Yeah,
Thanks
I
for
think
putting
this
it
is
together.
yeah, I think this is a good topic about the execution strategy for the outcomes of the surveys. So I think this is great. Thanks, Tobias, as always.
If I can help you with anything there, Adam, with sorry, my voice. If I can help you with the surveys or anything that you're working on there, drop me a ping. I would be happy to do so. Chris, Jordan, it has been an absolute pleasure. I wish you a wonderful start in the week.
Thanks, Tobias.
Take
See you
care.
next time.
Thank you, guys.
Toodles.